Before the bombs fell, before the speeches, before the uniforms filled American streets, there was a nation holding its breath, watching a distant world burn, telling itself the fire would never cross the ocean. Yet every headline, every sinking ship, every whispered radio report pulled the United States closer to a moment it could no longer escape. A moment when staying out would cost more than going in, and the illusion of safety would finally collapse. For most Americans in the late 1930s, war was something that happened elsewhere, across oceans and foreign borders, in places with names that felt far away and unreal. And the memory of the First World War still weighed heavily on the nation, a conflict that had taken young men overseas and returned many of them broken, leaving behind graves in Europe and bitterness at home. And when the Great Depression followed, many believed the country had paid dearly for involvement in a war that never truly belonged to it. So when Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany, rebuilding the German military in open defiance of the Treaty of Versailles, and when Japan expanded its empire across Asia, most Americans responded not with fear, but with distance, convinced that Europe's problems were Europe's responsibility, and Asia's conflicts belonged to Asia. And this belief shaped policy as much as public opinion, leading Congress to pass a series of neutrality acts beginning in 1935 that restricted arms sales, loans, and involvement with nations at war, reflecting a deep desire to stay out at almost any cost. And President Franklin D. Roosevelt, though personally alarmed by the rise of dictatorships, moved carefully, knowing that pushing the nation toward war too quickly could fracture public support and undermine democracy itself. As the 1930s progressed, the world grew more unstable, with Italy invading Ethiopia in 1935, Germany remilitarizing the Rhineland in 1936, and the Spanish Civil War erupting as a violent struggle between democracy and authoritarianism. And yet, in American homes, these events often felt like distant storms reported by newspapers and radios, tragic but contained. Until September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, using speed, coordination, and overwhelming force in a new form of warfare that shocked observers around the world. And within days, Britain and France declared war on Germany, marking the official beginning of World War II in Europe. And still, the United States remained officially neutral, with Roosevelt promising Americans that he would do everything in his power to keep the country out of the conflict, even as he warned that the war threatened global stability in ways no ocean could fully contain. As Europe descended into war, the United States found itself pulled into a dangerous balancing act, trying to support democratic nations without crossing the line into open conflict. And Roosevelt began to search for ways to aid Britain and France without violating neutrality laws or provoking isolationist backlash, leading to policies like cash and carry, which allowed nations at war to purchase American goods if they paid in cash and transported them themselves. A policy that favored Britain with its powerful navy and subtly aligned American industry with the Allied cause, even as Roosevelt insisted the nation was not taking sides. And when France fell to Germany in June of 1940, collapsing in a matter of weeks and leaving Britain alone against Nazi power, the shock rippled across America, forcing many to reconsider the belief that distance alone could guarantee safety. Because if France could fall so quickly, then the world was changing faster than anyone had imagined. Britain's survival became a central concern, not only because of shared language and history, but because a Europe dominated by Nazi Germany would reshape global power in ways that threatened American security and trade. And as German aircraft bombed British cities during the Battle of Britain, Americans listened to radio broadcasts describing nightly air raids and civilian endurance, and sympathy for Britain grew, though fear of another world war remained strong. And Roosevelt, re-elected to an unprecedented third term in 1940, understood that public opinion was shifting slowly, but not yet ready for open war. So he spoke of the United States as the arsenal of democracy, a nation that could supply weapons and materials to those fighting tyranny without sending its own soldiers into battle. And this idea took concrete form in March 1941 with the Lend-Lease Act, which allowed the United States to lend or lease military equipment to countries whose defense was considered vital to American security. primarily Britain at first and later the Soviet Union after Germany invaded it in June 1941. And while this policy stopped short of declaring war, it represented a major step away from neutrality, effectively aligning American resources with the Allied war effort. And critics warned that it would inevitably draw the nation into the conflict, while supporters argued that helping allies now would prevent a greater war later. At sea, the Atlantic Ocean became a tense and dangerous frontier, with German U-boats attacking Allied shipping in an effort to cut off supplies to Britain. And though American ships were supposed to remain neutral, incidents began to occur that tested that status, including the sinking of the USS Reuben James in October 1941 after it was torpedoed by a German submarine while escorting a convoy near Iceland, resulting in the loss of American lives. An event that shocked the nation and made it increasingly difficult to argue that the United States was not already involved. And Roosevelt responded by authorizing the U.S. Navy to escort Allied convoys part of the way across the Atlantic, a move that brought American and German forces into direct contact, even as both sides avoided a formal declaration of war. Meanwhile, in Asia, another crisis was unfolding that would prove even more decisive, as Japan, driven by a desire for resources and regional dominance, had been at war with China since 1937, committing acts of aggression that drew international condemnation. And the United States, which had significant economic interests in the Pacific and strong ties to China, watched Japan's expansion with growing concern, especially as Japanese forces moved into French Indochina in 1940, threatening British and Dutch colonies in Southeast Asia. And in response, the United States began to impose economic sanctions, restricting exports of aviation fuel, scrap metal, and eventually oil, resources vital to Japan's military and industrial power. And these sanctions were intended to pressure Japan into changing course, but they also cornered Japanese leaders, who saw access to American oil as essential to their survival as a modern power. Diplomatic negotiations between Washington and Tokyo continued throughout 1941, with both sides hoping to avoid war, but their goals remained fundamentally opposed, as the United States demanded that Japan withdraw from China and respect international agreements, while Japan sought recognition of its dominance in Asia and an end to economic pressure. And as talks dragged on without resolution, Japanese military planners prepared for the possibility of war, believing that if conflict with the United States was inevitable, it would be better to strike first and neutralize American power in the Pacific before it could fully mobilize. Back in the United States, the sense of impending crisis grew stronger, though many Americans still hoped diplomacy would prevail, and life went on in factories, schools, and small towns, even as the nation quietly prepared for the possibility of war, expanding its military through the first peacetime draft in American history in 1940, increasing defense production and building new ships and aircraft, all while officially maintaining peace. And Roosevelt continued to walk a careful line in his speeches, warning of global danger while promising to keep American boys out of foreign wars unless absolutely necessary. By late 1941, the pressure was building on every front, with American warships patrolling the Atlantic, American factories supplying Allied armies, and American diplomats struggling to contain a growing crisis in the Pacific. And the idea that the United States could remain completely separate from the conflict was becoming harder to sustain. Yet no single moment had yet shattered the fragile balance, and many still believed that war could be avoided, that the oceans would hold, and that reason would prevail. Until early December, when signals and intelligence reports hinted that something was about to happen, though no one could say exactly where or when. And as Sunday morning dawned on December 7, 1941 in Hawaii, thousands of miles from Washington, Americans were waking up to what they believed would be another quiet day, unaware that within hours, events would unfold that would force the nation to confront the question it had been avoiding for years. And as messages began racing across the Pacific toward the mainland, carrying news that would change everything, the United States stood on the edge of a decision that could no longer be delayed. The messages that raced east that morning carried fragments at first, confused reports sent from military stations in Hawaii to Washington. Words that did not yet form a full picture, but were alarming enough to freeze conversations and stop routine work. And as confirmation arrived, the reality became impossible to deny. Japanese aircraft had attacked the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, damaging battleships, destroying aircraft, and killing service members in an assault that stunned the nation. And within hours, the news spread across the mainland by radio, interrupting music and Sunday programs with urgent bulletins. And families gathered around living room radios, hearing phrases like air raid and this is not a drill, struggling to understand how war had reached American soil. Because until that moment, many had believed that distance still offered protection, that even if the world was at war, the United States could choose its level of involvement. But Pearl Harbor erased that belief in a single morning, transforming the debate from whether America should enter the war into how it would respond. President Roosevelt was informed shortly after the attack began, and by that evening, the scope of the damage was clear enough for him to prepare a message to Congress. And on December 8, 1941, he stood before lawmakers and the nation, calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy, describing the attack as sudden and deliberate, and asking Congress to declare that a state of war existed between the United States and Japan. And the response was swift and overwhelming. With only one dissenting vote, Congress approved the declaration. And across the country, enlistment offices filled with volunteers, factories prepared for round-the-clock production, and the emotional distance that had defined the previous years vanished almost overnight, replaced by a sense of unity, shock, and determination. Because the war was no longer theoretical or distant, it was personal. Within days, Germany and Italy, honoring their alliance with Japan, declared war on the United States, and America responded in kind, officially entering a global conflict that spanned Europe, Africa, and Asia. And the decision that had seemed so difficult for so long was now unavoidable, not because of ideology alone, but because American territory, forces, and lives had been attacked, and neutrality was no longer possible in any meaningful sense. The reasons America could no longer stay out of the war, however, extended beyond Pearl Harbor itself, because the attack was not an isolated event, but the culmination of years of mounting pressure, economic ties, political values, and strategic realities that had steadily narrowed the nation's choices. And once war began, these underlying factors became even clearer. The industrial power of the United States, already mobilizing in limited ways before December 1941, expanded rapidly, turning automobile plants into tank factories and assembly lines into sources of aircraft and ships, supplying not only American forces but Allied armies around the world, fulfilling Roosevelt's vision of an arsenal of democracy. And the nation's economic strength became a decisive factor in the conflict, demonstrating that even before formal entry, American involvement had been shaping the war's direction. In Europe, American entry transformed the balance of power, bringing fresh resources and eventual manpower to a struggle that had exhausted Britain and the Soviet Union. And while U.S. forces would not land in large numbers until later, the commitment itself sent a powerful signal that Nazi Germany would face not only resistance, but sustained opposition from an industrial giant capable of fighting a long war. And for American leaders, this commitment was rooted in the understanding that a world dominated by authoritarian regimes would threaten democratic values, global trade, and long-term security, making isolation not just impractical, but dangerous. At home, the war reshaped daily life, with rationing, war bonds, and shared sacrifice becoming common experiences. And while the nation united in many ways, it also faced difficult contradictions, including the internment of Japanese Americans, a policy driven by fear rather than evidence, reminding future generations that even just wars can produce unjust actions. And these complexities became part of the broader story of America's entry into World War II, showing that the choice to fight did not erase internal struggles or moral challenges. As the months passed and American forces engaged in battles across the Pacific and Europe, the initial shock of Pearl Harbor gave way to a deeper understanding of why the war could not be avoided, because the interconnected world of the 20th century meant that economic collapse, territorial conquest, and ideological aggression in one region could not be contained without consequences elsewhere. And the United States, with its global interests and democratic ideals, could not remain untouched indefinitely. Looking back, it becomes clear that America's path to war was shaped by a gradual erosion of distance, neutrality, and choice, driven by the rise of aggressive powers, the fall of allies, the demands of global trade, and the limits of diplomacy under pressure. And when the final line was crossed on December 7, 1941, it revealed what had been true for some time, that the United States was already deeply entangled in the fate of the world, and that staying out was no longer an option that could preserve either peace or security. And in choosing to fight, the nation accepted the cost of engagement over the greater cost of withdrawal, stepping fully into a war that would redefine its role on the global stage for generations to come.